Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is Atam Verdi and from AspinallVerdi, and today we'll be discussing the challenges and solutions for affordable housing. I'm joined by a number of panel members. Alice Pittini, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you very much. So my name is Alice Pittini and I'm currently the Research Director at Housing Europe, which is the European Federation of Public, Cooperative and Social Housing Providers in Europe.
Thanks, Alice. David?
Hello, everybody. My name's David Perry. I'm a solicitor and partner in the real estate team at Shoosmiths, a major UK law firm. I'm National Head of Affordable Housing there, which means that I work with a number of stakeholders within the sector across development, investment and asset management.
And next, Professor Stadimira Mikaleva.
Hi everyone, my name is Stadimira Mikaleva. I'm professor in real estate finance at University College London, and I'm the director of the Affordable Housing Group within the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction.
Thanks, Danny. Just before we go into the slide deck, there is a chat box within which you'll be able to submit questions to the panel, and that would really help us bring this conversation to life. It's going to be hopefully a conversational session here. And so I'll try and bring in your questions and the speakers to address some of those questions. So please do use that, and the question box should be on your screen. And then could we just move on to the first question? So first of all, we're going to discuss how do you define affordable housing, and Alice will pick this up and lead off for us.
Thank you very much. Can I start trying giving a reply to the question?
Yeah, certainly.
Should I turn on my camera as well?
I think we're keeping the cameras off.
Right. Sure. Yeah, thank you very much for the question, actually, which is, I think, a really nice entry point to today's webinar. And thanks a lot for giving me the floor as a first speaker. It's an honor and also a challenge at the same time. So I will try to give some inputs around this question, which is by no means an easy question to answer. So I think the first thing to say about how you define affordable housing is that, I mean, there's very little agreement at the international level on how housing affordability should be defined. So the most common method to look at housing affordability is to compare housing expenditure to income of households naturally. And this is an approach that it's used, well, around the world really. And what is also quite common, and we will find in many, for example, Anglophone countries, is to define a threshold of housing costs on income, beyond which housing is considered to be not affordable. Typically, that would be around 30% of income spent on housing costs. It's also interesting that Eurostat at European level has developed a definition of what they call housing overburden. So according to this Eurostat definition, households who have to spend more than 40% of their available income on housing, and this includes rents, mortgage payments, but also utility bills and other related housing expenses, they are considered to be overburdened by housing costs. So meaning, in theory, they're spending too much compared to their incomes. In reality, this indicator, which is commonly used at European level. It's quite controversial in itself because it doesn't take into consideration, for instance, the quality of the homes we're talking about. So somebody might be living in a very affordable home, but that it's not adapted to their needs, or it's not in adequate conditions. Also, and most important, well, what we find is that, of course, it's mainly lower income households who find themselves in this situation of being overburdened by housing costs. But what it's also true is that spending more than 40% of your income on housing doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot afford it. And what is more important is maybe to look at what's left of somebody's income after paying for housing. So I think a definition that I myself particularly like is one by Professor Mark Stevens of the University of Glasgow, and he was explaining that to him housing is affordable when housing of an acceptable minimum standard can be obtained and retained, leaving sufficient income to meet essential non-housing expenditure. So to put it very simply, housing is affordable if it leaves you enough resources to cover for other fundamental needs. And I think this is a very useful approach. Something else that maybe it's worth mentioning already at the start of this webinar is that I think other countries have borrowed from the UK the term affordable housing. And this is more and more used in policy circles. And what actually it's meant by affordable housing changes a lot according to the different context and the different policies that are in place. So let's say that in general, we hear more and more talk about affordable housing to define and include a range of policy measures, whether it's direct funding or things like tax reliefs to different kind of providers and developers, that basically whereby the focus is really on the outcome, so is to have something that it's more affordable than what would be commonly found on the market. And maybe last point about this, because it's a term that is often related to policies and policy measures, is that it's also, I mean, it varies to very different degrees from one country to another, but it's a general trend over the past decades to witness decrease in public investment into housing supply, I would say, across Europe. And this is often mentioned as one of the elements that determined a shortage of affordable housing in many countries. So maybe I will stop here.
Thanks,
the first reaction.
Sorry.
Right.
I think, sorry. Is that Stanny? We'll move on to the next question. I thought Alice, the definition from Mark Stevens was really interesting, and I think we may come back to that in some of the other questions that we have later on. But there was one thought that I had, which was about whether there's you could comment maybe later on about the different levels of investment that are being put in by different governments, different regimes, particularly across Europe, into addressing affordable housing concerns. We'll move on to the next question in terms of why there's an affordable housing shortage, and Stanimira will lead off on that particular question.
Thank you very much, Atam, and thank you very much, Alice. That's really very helpful. Just very briefly on the definitions of affordable housing, particularly in England, and I will show you some. I will discuss some data with you. what I mean under affordable housing is how the government defines affordable housing and how in particular they measure the supply of affordable housing units. So A, the existing stock that's out there, and B, new supply, so new construction of affordable housing units. And the most dominant form of affordable housing is the so-called affordable rent, which is sub-market rent, maybe capped at 80% of market rent in a given local authority, and also shared ownership, which is quite unique product for the UK. I'm not aware of a similar scheme abroad, but maybe Alice can has more insights on that, where you are essentially buying a share, a proportion of the entire property with most likely a mortgage. And then on the other proportion of the property, you are paying subsidized rent to a so-called housing association. In the past, historically, over the years, we've had the dominance of the so-called social rent, which is much more heavily subsidized, where the rent is much cheaper than the one for affordable rent, and people need to register to enter into such social rent homes, and there is a waiting list for that, which at the moment is very long. It's over 1 million people waiting on the waiting list for social rent housing. And then the other policy, just to set the scene a bit, is the right to buy scheme, which was introduced by Margaret Thatcher in 1980, which essentially allows people, social tenants, people living in social accommodation, to purchase this home at subsidized prices, which meant that over the years, the stock of affordable housing, and affordable housing here is used to include social housing and sub-market housing, has declined because it hasn't been a one-to-one replacement of the social housing that is leaving the social housing stock by through purchases of right to buy and new construction. But again, the most common affordable housing tenures now are the affordable housing rent and the shared ownership. So on average, between 1991 and 2022, the new supply of affordable housing in England is around 50,000 units per year. And in the last year, for which we have data, again, this is publicly available data, into the 2021 to 2022, the supply of new affordable housing, as defined, as I explained, is 60,000 units for 1 year. And as compared, the supply of total housing in England for the last year is 210,000 units. So affordable housing is about 30% of all new supply of housing in England. So it's a substantial part, and it's been growing in the last 10 years, but it has dipped in 2015. There was a significant dip in construction. So the highest supply of affordable housing was in the 90s of nearly 75,000 units. What we see when we analyze data is that the supply of affordable housing is very volatile, and in particular, it has been very volatile in the last decade. And to my understanding, it's been more volatile than the supply of general housing. And this can be partially due to the so-called Affordable Homes Program, which works, it's very much aligned with the political cycles, and it's about 5 years. So these are grants to so-called registered providers to build affordable housing units, which so the construction is subsidized. And what we see is that towards the end of the funding period, when the houses have to be built, this is like a requirement of the funding, the supply goes up, but in the beginning of the funding period, the supply is quite low. So it's quite cyclical, which I guess is not an intended consequence of affordable housing supply, which ideally should reflect the demand for affordable housing. So for example, in 2014, the supply of new affordable housing was 65,000 units, but the following year, it was only half of it. So it's not a steady supply, right? But the demand for affordable housing is quite steady and it's increasing. So we can see that there are years where there are more people waiting for social housing or affordable housing and years where there is less. Okay, let me, yeah, so I mentioned this, I'm just kind of looking at my notes. Since 2011, what we see is a huge drop in social rent. And between 2012 and 2014, the new supply of social rent has decreased almost fourfold. So there used to be 38,000 social rent units in particular, which has fallen in 2014 to 11,000 social rent units. And in the last year, we have constructed 7,500 social rent units. So for the entire, for England, right, for the entire country. So it's a very small supply of social rent. And instead what we have is shared ownership and affordable rent. Just to put it in perspective, according to Shelter, which is a charity supporting homelessness, 40,000 households were homeless in 2020, and 95,000 households were in temporary accommodation. So the new supply does not match the demand, and this is in particular for social rent. And the situation is not looking great when you also look at waiting lists for social rent, where there are 1.2 million households in England which are currently on waiting lists. So in terms of how the developments are funded, in the last year, in 2021-2022 cycle, about half of the those new supply of affordable homes is funded through the so-called Affordable Homes Program, and the other half is funded through Section 106 agreements, which is part of a planning requirement when you construct new developments. So it's subsidized housing, and a large proportion is still funded through the Section 106 agreements, but a very large proportion is funded through the 10 billion or 11 billion program, which is the Affordable Homes Program. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. I'm just going to ask the speakers to put their cameras on. Apologies, I got that wrong. That's my fault. So if the speakers could put their cameras on, please. Thanks for that. I mean, I thought that was really interesting because I think in summary, politics and policy have a significant bearing, I think, Stanley, on the delivery of affordable housing, be that funding or clearly the right to buy. Now, I know that there are quite a few people, attendees to this webinar, that are not from the UK, so I'll just take a second to explain what the right to buy is. So as I understand it, in the English and Wales context, people who live within social housing can qualify to purchase their home outright at a discount, and this was introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government some decades ago and continues, and Stanley's referred to the fact that so much of that social housing stock has been taken into the private sector, basically. We'll move on to the next question, which is around, and I think it leads on nicely to the next question, which is how can better policies lead to more affordable housing? And David will lead off on that one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Atam. I'd agree with everything that you've just said and that Stanley and Alice have said. I think in terms of affordable housing provision, I mean, the answer is we definitely need policies and better policies to help with affordable housing provision. I'd widen it a bit. If you think that affordable housing is merely just certain segments of the housing portfolio, the national housing portfolio, there's a bigger issue, which is we're short of houses. So if we can deal with housing provision generally, then almost by definition, planning policy will help deliver additional affordable housing on top of that. But I'd say, I think specifically around affordable housing, we need some stability with policies rather than overload. We've had a torrent of policy in recent years, and I think it's been driven by recent administrations, certainly in England, who've been perhaps a bit more focused on home ownership rather than rental. So there's been a very definite political drive in a certain direction, which I think realistically, and not making a political point, making a practical social point, affordable housing is there to support people who can't afford to participate at market levels, whether that's market levels of rent or market levels of buying. So we need, how can I put it, we need a bit of sympathy and a bit of pragmatism in terms of our policies, rather than perhaps a bit of direct social engineering. I think where we need to get with this is that we need to be able to support developers and investors to drive delivery, because the demand is there, it's the supply that's the problem. And that could be land prices, that could be materials costs. It's been a rather difficult 2 years for external factors that probably nobody in Britain had foreseen would happen. But all of those contribute to frustration of delivery. And if we think about planning in particular, is it about planning control or is it about planning delivery? You know, we've got developers struggling with biodiversity net gain. In the UK, we've got planners struggling with the neutralities, nutrient neutralities. We've got first homes have been introduced as a supposedly affordable offering, but I'd say it's more developer based and it's less focused at housing associations. It's another segment of affordable housing provision that isn't really targeted at your core affordable housing providers. We've got problems now with local plan making. We've had problems in Scotland with rent controls damaging PRS provision. There's an awful lot going on top of all of previous administrations' legislative changes around tenure structures. So there's a huge amount to process, and actually it takes time to get housing developments through the planning system and get them delivered. So there's a bit of a sense, I think, throughout the sector that we are constantly playing catch up with the next new initiative. Maybe if we could have some policies that were focused on stability, we might actually then have the ability to shift towards delivery.
Thanks, David. I think that's a really good summary of this situation, certainly in the UK. I was just wondering whether Alice or Stanley had any comments on a European perspective. You know, is there a similar picture of dare I say, tinkering with policy or the politics around policy making and affordable housing happening?
Maybe I can just comment on just bringing an example of one recent initiative that we've been involved with as Housing Europe. So it's the so-called Housing 2030 initiative that was led by Housing Europe and 2 different UN agencies that produced excellent report written in cooperation with a group of academics. And I think what is interesting in this initiative is that they looked at concrete solutions that have proved to work, at least in their own context, and also try to understand to what extent this can be transferable or not, because this is also a big problem in housing policies. You hear a lot of good practices, but to what extent they can be transferred through, I mean, in another countries or even in another time frame. That's often tricky. But I think what is very interesting also about this initiative is that it looks at policies in a quite an integrated way. So they cover governance, land policy, financing, and sustainability. And I think when it comes to housing policies, indeed, it's often the case that they are approached somehow in silos. And while I mean there should be much more coordination between the different level and the different policies, but definitely planning is one of the key points everywhere, where we see also severe mismatches. So very important topic raised by David indeed.
Great, thank you. Should we move swiftly on to the next topic area, which is around how do you solve the problem of affordable housing for key workers? And I think David again is going to kick us off with this one.
Yeah, sure. I suppose the answer is not easily, and I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution to this. And it probably reflects some of the previous comments that we had on better policies for helping to deliver affordable housing and housing in general. I suspect that what we don't want are vast dormitories for key workers to be housed in. I think the day of having perhaps a nurse's home next to hospitals has probably come and gone. I think if we think of housing in terms of community building, what we actually need to be driving or ensuring is that everybody can afford somewhere to live at their price point that's decent, livable and sustainable, regardless of whether that's a flat or a house. I think the idea of perhaps just saying we'll have large-scale dormitory buildings specifically for key workers probably isn't attractive to developers because it's subsidised housing, probably isn't particularly attractive to investors for much the same reason, and actually doesn't reflect the way that people live. So I think this is really just a shade of what we've already been talking about, which is that we need a balanced scorecard with housing provision, which is that you'll have top-end housing, and then you'll have middle-ranking housing, and then you'll have social rented housing perhaps underpinning all of that. And you need to be able to find somewhere to live to suit your job. The only bit I'd add to this is it's not a simple solution of just building more housing. You've got to think about mobility and other transport infrastructure that sits around that, because if people are travelling a distance to work, they need to know that they'll be able to actually do that affordably as well. There's a much bigger piece. It's not just around building large blocks of flats.
Yeah, thanks, David. Again, just for the benefit of people who may not be familiar with the term within the UK context, key workers are generally defined as those people that are providing public services and are under a certain income threshold, if I can put it like that. And I think the interesting question, going right back to the first question around how do you define affordable housing, there's a similar question about how do you define a key worker, and equity across society about access to good quality affordable housing as well. So I think if there's someone that wants to comment on that, but I think there's a lot of other questions and discussions that you could have just around this, but I think you've touched on those, David. I think unless there's any specific comment there, and just again, a reminder for those in the audience that please do feel free to ask questions, and I'll try and bring those in as we go along. We'll move on to how can we increase the supply of affordable housing, and Stanley will pick this one up.
That's an interesting question. What I want to start with is that a core issue actually at hand of why we're having this problem, and it's an international problem about unaffordability. That's not just in the UK, that's in the US, that's in Europe, that's in developing countries as well, is this institutional political drive for home ownership that's been there for several decades, right? And that was pushed in the US, that's been pushed in the UK. It's really the main political agenda is to increase home ownership. So the affordable housing that's being built is in 2 tenures, as I said. One tenure is ownership through shared ownership. So owning a small share is equivalent to being a homeowner, even though you don't own the full share, but it's considered as ownership. And rental tenure, where you rent accommodation, which stays in the affordable housing stock for other generations to use as well. So that's a problem which, if you produce a tenure to buy, that tenure leaves the stock, and you constantly need to keep replenishing it. So the first question is, what kind of tenure of affordable housing do we need? Because when we talk about affordable housing, as Alex explained, it's very generic, and we need to actually identify what exactly do we need. And I think most countries, or in particular this country, needs more social tenure. And as most of the panelists would agree, building social tenure by for-profit institutions is not a good idea, because there are better alternatives within the real estate universe. We have seen in the last couple of years, in the last few years, the entrance of large institutional investors in the UK market, which is not something that the UK has done for many years, which is different from the US. In the US, we have been having large dominance of institutional investors in the housing market, in the housing rental market, and so they can be private equity funds or other forms of unlisted funds as well, which would either develop or buy existing affordable housing stock. But we shouldn't forget that for-profit providers, when we rely on them constructing affordable housing homes, they will be interested to achieve the required rate of return for the investors. If they need to justify a lower rate of return, then perhaps if we want to be more creative, we can say, okay, you have a lower rate of return, but instead you're achieving impact. So you're trading financial returns with impact, social impact in particular. And pension funds, can try to look into that. And it comes to measurement, and how do you measure the social impact, and how do you demonstrate it to your investors, and how do you convince your investors? But there is very new academic research looking into that, into the performance of funds as compared to impact funds, and they show that the impact funds are underperforming the other funds because they are more willing to trade financial performance to impact, right? So it's this acceptance of, do I want to do good as an employer? Do I want my pension fund to probably give me a little bit less return so that they can build more social housing? So that's how the private sector can contribute if there is more acceptance, which of course it's a long way to go. The other one is just to have more direct subsidies into the construction of social rent, so subsidizing more heavily the construction of social rent. So because so many social rent units through the right to buy scheme are leaving the affordable housing stock. So the stock of social rent is decreasing because of the right to buy scheme. And another option is to basically reverse the right to buy scheme and say, okay, you cannot buy your home anymore. And I don't think that would be done, because this hasn't been done for how many, over 30 years. It hasn't been reversed yet. I don't think it's politically desired outcome. But yeah, so we need more subsidies essentially for social rent. There has to be more understanding of that. But the thing is that the priority has been on ownership. So social rent has fallen by the sideways essentially. So it's really aligning political objectives with outcomes as well.
Yeah.
And in terms of the affordable housing for middle income, because I keep talking about social rent, what I'm personally interested in, increasing affordability for middle-income households. We have the solution at the moment is the shared ownership scheme. That shared ownership scheme is very interesting scheme, but it's a very complex scheme for everyone involved in it. So I think doing more research in this field, which I'm trying to do, and increasing the transparency and the liquidity of this secondary market is very, very important. And just very quickly on the US, you asked me about other policies. So the US has implemented since the 80s the so-called low-income housing tax credits, which is an interesting program. I don't know why it hasn't been looked at in the UK, and this is currently implemented by Biden. I mean, similar strategy has been used where you essentially allow innovative companies or companies that do what they're expected to do to claim back tax, right? So it's been a very effective strategy in the US where developers build affordable housing according to specific definitions. The rent has to be capped, etc., for a specific period of time. The unit shouldn't leave the social rental market, but then those developers can claim the tax back. And it's most academics would agree, there's plenty of research on that program, that it's been overall a successful program in provision of affordable housing.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I'm going to ask for the next question to be put up on the screen, which is what role do institutional investors play in affordable housing, which is what you just touched upon. And from my own sort of perspective, I think we're already seeing institutional investment coming into the market in the UK, and you've mentioned the US. However, there's a question in my mind about the fact that policy, for example, within the English context, the government subsidises or has social payments to occupiers of social housing through housing benefit payments. So in a sense, the investors are looking at how the households are going to fund their rental payments, if you see what I mean. And there's a relationship there as well through property, through that mechanism. So, David, would you mind picking up? I think it's David picking up the it's Stanley picking up the institutional investors point.
Yeah, as you said, I did speak a little bit about that. So we've seen also in the US large private equity funds. I don't want to name specific ones here, but the reason why I pointed is because they really can make a huge impact, because we're talking here about millions and billions of, huge funding or huge financing. So institutional investors normally partner with developers to provide the financing, not the funding, but the financing. And they can structure the deal when it comes to development. They can structure the deal in a way that it allows the cash flows to be spread over a longer period of time. Because the usual model of financing new construction in the UK is the large house builders model, which is the residual rent valuation, where you build having a construction loan, and then you sell very quickly the units and pay back the loan, basically, right? So you are restricted how quickly you need to sell the units, depending on how much leverage you have, etc. And there is obviously a very hefty margin on top of this, which can be 20, 30%, etc. And it's very pro-cyclical, right? Like developers wouldn't build if it's not a good market and if they cannot achieve the margin. It's a very rational behavior. We can't blame investors or developers for acting the way they're acting, which of course has been happening. I personally think policies and regulations play a huge role in setting the institutional framework for aligning institutional investors' interests, which are for-profit interests, with government objectives, but we need to be realistic. How much institutional investors can achieve.
Great. Alice, did you have a point?
Yes, if we can just comment, I thought some of the points that were raised by Stanimira were very interesting. First of all, on the point of basically being careful in policy making about what we need to subsidize, and in particular talking about the, let's say, the push towards home ownership that's been typical of the UK, but not only. I think globally it's a general trend. And I think now what we see today, I mean, not going into details about investment in rental, but I think it's also some kind of new forms of semi ownership. You mentioned the shared ownership in the UK. There are similar examples in other countries, for instance, in Finland. But it's also, for example, what it's interesting now, we see in Belgium the development of a new movement for community land trusts, which is also interesting, because that's kind of a way whereby if there is some public funding involved, it goes into a system whereby homes can be sold, but they have to stay perpetually affordable, basically, because the ownership is split between the land and the building itself, so that the land stays in a local trust where the local authorities and local associations have a share. So this is interesting. Cooperatives are also in a way where when they are organized on a not-for-profit basis, they can work in a similar system. So I think these are all new trends that it's worth keeping an eye on. And when it comes to impact investing that you mentioned, I think this is also a key area where we will have to look into much more carefully in the future. From the social housing sector, there's a lot of interest and a lot of hope in the kind of ESG investment, so investment for environmental, social, and governance objectives. But we've seen little concrete examples of these actually materializing in Europe, a bit more in the UK, but much less in other European countries. And also when this is happening, and I'm talking about investors who are willing to basically borrow to put some money into housing associations activities, but this usually doesn't lead to lower interest rates or more favorable conditions for the providers. So this is something that we would really like to work more on in the future, and to try to understand if this can really be part of the solution.
Just to add to that, if I may, we've spoken to a number of funds who are interested in impact investment, and they see it absolutely as part of to use the phrase again, a balanced scorecard for their investments. I think there's a general understanding that returns on housing as an investment will probably never be stratospheric, but they ought to be consistent and they will be long term. So if you've got funds who are looking to place money as part of a wider portfolio, there's absolutely no reason at all why they shouldn't be looking at investing into housing in the wider sense. I think one of the issues here is about supply chain management, that the more tiers you have in a chain, from getting from a piece of land through to a built unit, if everybody's taking a turn at a step, eventually something has to give, and that will push prices up. But I think there's huge opportunity for institutional investment into this sector.
Yeah.
Can I just add something to that? If we think a little bit deeper in terms of, if we think what is a cash flow stream of social housing, of course it will be low rent from social tenants that are mostly low income or even unemployed people. So when we looked at very preliminary results, this is a report that's going to come up soon, in particular on shared ownership and rent arrears. So why would people stop paying rent in this affordable housing space? Often it's associated with health conditions. We obviously had that because of COVID, etc. But I'm including also mental health conditions because of personal circumstances. but also about job loss. And so in the affordable housing space, it's much harder to get evicted than in the private market. So you then, as an investor, you build up rent arrears, right? And which is something that might bother you. But the key question is, how quickly do these rent arrears get repaid, and how many repossessions they are of those units. And so I think historically, housing associations, moving at the corporate level, housing associations have not defaulted on their liabilities, right? So it gives these institutional investors a lot of credibility to provide financing through the channel of non-profit housing associations. And I think the data looks pretty good in terms of low risk. No, so it kind of looks low risk, low return. So this is one thing to highlight just in general. Yeah. So it's not very high risk.
I think that's a really good point, Stanley. And we have some questions. The first one I'll try and paraphrase is, do we think that the fragmentation of tenures and development sectors, i.e. by build to rent, PRS, etc., are simply pushing up land values and costs at the expense of people seeking homes? Is the creation of all these different sectors of the housing market actually a positive change or not?
I'd say it's a positive change. It's an institutionalization or a corporatization of what's already been there for a long time. If you think that basically most activities will follow the money, I think what you're tending to see now, certainly in the UK, you've seen a shift away from, for example, true private rented landlords to actual corporate PRS providers who operate in a completely different segment to, let's say, affordable housing providers, because they're trying to provide they're servicing a different market, but they're also providing something that adds additional value over and above merely a flat. And we're seeing huge movements now into single family housing, which I think has been something historically more popular overseas. But now, following the money, following the institutions, we're seeing a real drive with house builders partnering with PRS providers on the single family housing side. So I think there can be an issue with land prices, but I think that's probably coming from the supply side, not so much from the demand side. I mean, we on the strategic land side, we do see very bold expectations from surveyors in terms of what they think they can achieve for their clients on land prices. All that does is squeeze the margin in the middle for the ultimate developer. Yeah,
and just one further one. It may be any of the panelists that picked this up, but I suspect it might be you, David. Are there any stumbling blocks with institutional investors accessing grants such as Homes England's affordable housing grant programme in the UK? It's quite a specific question.
It's quite a specific question, that, isn't it? I suppose the biggest issue is you are stepping into a regulated environment. You have to play by the rules that regulator then sets out for you. And actually, recent experience has been that the 2021 funding round from Homes England now sets expectations with shared ownership leases that are disproportionately expensive to service. Sure. Yeah, in terms of interactions with clients.
The MNP requirements, right? The requirements to have some modern methods of construction, which was a key objective back then. Yes.
But also the whole operation of the shared ownership scheme under the new grant funding round has become, significantly more complex over and above that before. So there's an awful lot going on.
I wouldn't call it more complex. There was the change that it's the owner, so it's the registered provider which is in charge of any defects or structural changes in the property in the first 10 years, right? So obviously the risk has been shifted to the housing.
The risk has been shifted. Yeah.
Should we just move on to the next question, which is around the private rental sector. David, I don't know, I mean, we're kind of running rapidly out of time, so and I know we've been touching on this, so if you could maybe briefly comment on the PRS sector, that would be really useful.
Yeah, I think it's what I touched on before, just to keep this short, that I think PRS as a sector is occupying a slightly different space. And I know planning policy mandates that there's an affordable provision within that. But I think if you talk to your standard PRS provider, they would see their role as being somewhat different in terms of their community building mandate. I don't think they see themselves as first and foremost affordable housing providers. I think they see themselves as providing a slightly more premium offering, or a much more premium offering, that also caters for an affordable housing element within it.
Yeah, great. There is a question here which is quite an interesting one. Just like the banks had to be bailed out and were too big to fail, David, this is probably for you, but maybe for Stanley and Alice as well. Do you think there may be a vulnerability about private finance coming dominant in the affordable housing sector, thereby demanding rent indexation at public expense? I think the point being is that you get a sector that's so significant that then is the analogy the tail wags the dog? Because yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, actually, the affordable housing, according to the regulator, the affordable housing balance sheet is quite significant anyway. That there's an awful lot of money in the sector, albeit that it's tied up in bricks and mortar. What we've actually seen more recently in the last 6 months has been perhaps an unwillingness of some of the institutional investors to actually close on affordable housing deals, because there's been a sensitivity around interest rates and returns. So probably the lessons learned in 2008 have been rolled forward and applied slightly differently now. And certainly the recent challenges have not been about availability of money, they've been about the cost of money. So I think maybe the discussion has moved on.
Yeah,
I think in relation to that is to highlight that if you are renting, if you have a shared ownership or affordable rent unit, the rent is going up with inflation, right? With an inflation index. But this year it was capped. I think how many percent?
7%, yeah.
Yeah.
7%.
So it's not going to at the same pace as the inflation, which might create some worries.
Equally studying, as you know, that certainly in the English context, the government's not been increasing local housing allowances as well. So there's different layers to how affordable housing is being funded. Shall we just move on to Alice talking us again briefly? We may run out of time. We may run 5 minutes over, so apologies in advance, but about the consequences of the lack of affordable housing.
Thanks. That's a very wide, broad question again. I think maybe what I would like to focus on from a European perspective is what's happening in most European cities and capitals. So what we see today is really that the housing affordability problem is more and more increasingly concentrated into urban areas. So it's rather an urban issue, and it's reached really some extent that was not foreseeable until just a few years back. I'm taking just one example above all. I was looking into, again, data on housing cost overburden rates in Europe, and Portugal is one of the countries with typically a low overburden rate. But if you look at the capital city, Lisbon, over recent year, especially the rental market has been increasing so much that now people who were born in Lisbon are being constantly pushed out of the city because they cannot afford any longer to live there. Typically, young people or households with one single source of revenue will be completely priced out from the city itself. And this is, I mean, it's really a bit of an extreme case what's happening in Lisbon. We're talking about, let's say, an average revenue of €1,000, while rents have reached about 1,200 in the city or around the central areas. But we see some similar trends in many European cities. And I mean, part of the problem is also probably the spreading of short-term lettings type of accommodation, which is a big issue, especially in cities that are typical tourist destinations. But it's also a result of what's happening in terms of house price dynamics over the long term. And I think it's really interesting to keep monitoring what's happening in cities across Europe, because once again, what we see is a relatively dynamic situation, and one where we can generally say that we see a problem of outsiders and insiders, meaning those who are trying to move to the cities or take the first steps on the housing ladder there. They're really having a particularly hard time, and one that is not so clearly visible yet in statistics, let's say. So something really to keep in mind.
Yeah, so
here for this point.
Just a comment from me about, and a question to all of you really, about in our lifetimes, respectively, albeit I suspect I'm the oldest here, has housing moved from being a home to an asset class? And therefore, whether you're an individual investor or an institutional investor, what we've seen is that it's become more of an asset class, and therefore that has also had an impact on tenures and values. That's a question, but I'm just wondering what you think about that.
I'd agree with that, but I also tend to the view that housing is critical national infrastructure. It's not an investment opportunity. There may be a consequence of it being those things that allows it to be an investment opportunity, but it's fundamentally important to what we do. So I would see, certainly in terms of planning, consenting and delivery, I would see it as critical national infrastructure. And I think if we were talking about any policy changes, it ought to be around directing policy towards delivery of critical infrastructure, rather than what that may do is then remove the YIMBYism, NIMBYism argument out of things. We may get away from arguments about whether homes are beautiful or not, and schemes failing to be consented because of central government stepping in on a point of aesthetics rather than a point of supporting society. We almost need to be a little bit more directed in terms of how we look at delivery, which is not to say that we have a planning free for all, just to be really clear on that. I'm not saying build anything anywhere. I'm not at all an advocate of that, but I do think that we should accept that it's vitally important on many levels, and we ought to treat it with that level of seriousness.
Yeah, I think that would be great if it's considered infrastructure, social infrastructure. But the result out of that is that the investors would pull out of it because it wouldn't be an investment asset anymore. And then the government has to step in and subsidize it, as it's subsidizing the NHS and other services. So this has to be a substantial shift in government funding into this.
Yeah.
I think another point to this is that I think depending on how the use for homes, whether they are just to fulfill an essential need basically or an asset class, as you mentioned, it also leads to different consequences to the local economy, the local structure and the local reality. Because for instance, for people who actually live there, some services will always be necessary and essentials, but maybe not for investors.
Yeah.
And I think you can still consent it as infrastructure, even if you then invest in it as an asset class. So I think there's a hybrid position here that needs to be adopted so that we maintain the inflow of institutional money, but we just actually consider proper delivery vehicles for housing supply.
That's great. Well, should we just move on to the last question, which are what are some of the examples from cities and housing strategies that we can learn from? And I think, Alice, you were going to talk to this one.
Thanks a lot. I think I probably have 2 seconds for this
It's
question.
fine. We've got a few minutes.
All right. Oh, maybe, I mean, there are many examples that could be mentioned. One of them, which has come to be particularly well known recently, I think, for all of those interested in housing, is the case of Vienna, the Austrian capital, which is a bit of a special case. You have to think that half of the population in Vienna lives into some sort of social housing, basically, more or less split between half and half public housing owned by the city housing company, and the other half is run by limited profit companies and cooperatives that receive some public support, but also are partly financed through private loans. So, and this has allowed basically the city over time to keep a large affordable housing sector. It's also quite let's say, specific case in that housing policies are really something that seems to be quite strongly felt by the local population. Like they regularly run surveys about the level of satisfaction with the local housing policies, which is something that I think it's unthinkable in many other contexts. For example, in Italian cities where I'm from, it's something unheard of. But I think also interesting about the Vienna example, and maybe something that can be learned from it. So of course, the large public housing sector was mainly developed, let's say, at the beginning of the 20th century. So it was a different historical context. But the way they keep encouraging affordable housing supply is also through their planning and zoning policies. So the city owns housing fund, a land and housing fund that basically is in charge of putting public land up for sale, but usually in this kind of tender process that are open to all kinds of organizations, whether for not-for-profit or completely private. There is always dedicated shares and guidance on the type of homes and the type of affordable housing that they want to see built. So this is a really interesting example. There are many others. Another one that comes to mind is the case of Barcelona, that in the last 5 to 6 years has had a very, very active housing policy. Building more public housing, but also trying to build public-private partnerships, also supporting a number of local associations and organizations. But at the same time, the starting point is so different. You have to think, we said Vienna, half of the housing stock is social housing. In Barcelona, they're starting from 1 to 2%. So of course, the starting point really influences and has an impact on what can be achieved over a relatively short period of time. But these are some ideas.
That's great. Hey, just one final question, and then I think we'll bring the discussion to a close. How impactful has the participation of housing associations been since the tackling of affordable housing problem was recognised? I think the question is really about how effective has the housing association movement been. Any last comments?
Yeah, it was a shift from local authorities constructing these affordable homes to housing associations doing that, right? And they are only focused on the affordable housing sector. So they are social landlords, right? So I think that you can talk to them. This is my impression. I don't have a personal experience, but you can talk to. There is some sort of competition because there are like over 1,000 housing associations. They are very big players on the market that are acting also as developers, also building market housing and selling that market housing. but you can talk to your social landlord if you have like a personal issue and be understood, unlike when you have a private landlord. And I think it provides stability, which David mentioned in the very beginning, which I want to highlight now at the end, that stability and certainty is very important, both for tenants and for investors. So on the rental side of things, having this stability, as an institutional framework that creates stability, predictability, it's very, very important. And I think housing associations, just working with housing associations, I've had great experience. I find the people very friendly and very approachable. So it's a non-profit, charitable sector.
Yeah, good. And we've just at time now, so I'd like to thank Alice, David and Stani for their contributions today, which I hope everyone felt were really interesting. I certainly did. All the presentation today has been recorded, and that will be shared together with a written summary of the webinar. And those are, you can invite other people to watch those, so you can share those. When we close the webinar, you'll be asked to leave, there'll be an online poll, and we'd be very grateful if you could respond to that to give us some feedback. You can obviously follow the RICS on Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. So I think that brings us to an end. There is also a podcast series. So until the next time, goodbye and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.